All right, good afternoon to everyone. I was kind of talking to myself. Wow, I shouldn't have said that out loud because that was a direct message from a friend. But yes, I was talking to myself, trying to get all of these controls set up before I get started. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. And I am excited as some of my friends are, to be presenting to you just a little bit of some of the work that I've been doing with Miami University. So without any further ado, as the old saying goes, let's get this show on the road. All right, so it's not very often that I need to give an introduction of myself, but just in case there is anyone who has no idea who I am and just found the link floating around in some group or on Facebook or Instagram, my name is Delreco Bonaby. Friends know me as Rico. I am an MA student at Miami University, so that is not the Miami that we as Bahamians have a tendency to think about, where the broke people go, as the girl said. But this is Miami, Ohio. So it's Miami University in Ohio. I'm a part of the Global Fields program, and I am studying biology. That is easy for everyone to guess, right? My prior studies were at the College of the Bahamas, now University of the Bahamas. I studied biology there, minor in chemistry, finished that degree with credit. And every day, most days, once it's not summertime, I am a school teacher. So I have taught in Bimini, as well as here in New Providence. And I'm currently at Queens College over there on Village Road. I added a few more bits and pieces at the bottom, just so you all could think that I am brainy if you don't know me already. So I'm a nature lover, have always been. I'm an amateur bird watcher, amateur because I don't own my own, what's it called? Can't remember what they're called. I don't own my own binoculars, and I am a stargazer. I can consider myself almost a professional stargazer. I have an equatorially mounted telescope. All right, so let's get, So before I get started, I did run into an old friend in the supermarket after they had seen the flyer. And my friend was like, they didn't know that I was into the environment or environmental science and ecology and all of that stuff. So I wanted to remember to say that I have also volunteered with the Nature Conservancy a few times. I was a volunteer research assistant for Dr. Sarah Wise. She was doing work on climate change and blue holes. It was an ethnographic study. That was the first time I ever heard of that business. And if you watch ZNS broadcasting in between the news, if you've ever caught any of those animated coral reef videos, my voice is in a few of those. And I also have a teensy bit of screen time in the brief coral virtual field trip. So yes, I've been doing environmental stuff for quite a while, just not central to my activities, right? So just a wee bit about this project. So yes, I'm in the Global Field Program at Miami University. We have what are called inquiry action projects, and they are exactly what they sound like. So the first half of this business was conducting a study and inquiry-based project. Mine was a literature review. And then the second half is an action component, and that is why you all are here with me this afternoon. So the action can be, big or small, but you want to take what it is that you would have learned while completing your inquiry project or the inquiry component of your project, and in some way benefit your community, the communities that you live in. And that is one of the major thrusts of the Global Field Program at Miami University. Great. Now that all of that hot air is out, we can get into the business of crabs. What about crabs, right? So first off, what on earth is a crab? Well, they are members of the phylum arthropods. They're arthropods, right? So these are animals that have segmented bodies, but more importantly, they have an exoskeleton, right? There are about 1 million odd of them And just about 1 million of those things are insects. And then you also have crustaceans, the arachnids, as well as your centipedes and millipedes, right? But once we get a little bit more specific down to the subphylum, crabs, as you well know, I imagine, are crustaceans, right? More specifically, they are decapods. Now, the decapod group includes crabs, lobsters, shrimp, crayfish, all of those things, right? And they have dozens of appendages, but usually 10 of them are what we as people consider to be legs. So if you look at the word decapod and you think you see something jumping out at you, if you know prefixes and suffixes well, then you do, right? Because deca means 10 and pod or poda refers to feet, right? So it literally translates to 10-footed. And usually 2 of those are modified as pincers or chelae. Great stuff. So you see another huge word there, brachyurans, right? So everything that is a true crab is in that group, right? And these true crabs, they have a reduced abdomen, or in a sense, you want to think of it as them not having a tail, right? So your shrimp, when you think of shrimp, you see a tail. When you think of lobsters, you see a tail. But when you think of a crab, there's nothing that looks like a tail, right? There are also another group of crabs, and it's represented on the slide here right now, the little guy with the little sad face. He's in a different group, right, called the false crabs. I don't know why we as scientists do that, poor thing. It's like demoting Pluto from its status as a planet, right? But they're just a little bit different from the true crabs. And so they are not a part of the group that we're going to be looking at. So we're getting a little bit more Pacific, not the ocean, right? Land crabs now, right? So there is a family of crabs. They're called the G-carcinidae crabs or the G-carcinid crabs. And these crabs are highly modified or highly adapted to terrestrial life, life outside of water, or at least outside of that marine environment where many of their ancestors, all of their ancestors, sorry, would have been derived from, right? So how are they adapted to this? Well, certainly they need to be able to regulate their water balance well. So they have very special osmoregulatory processes and organs. They also have special means to, by which to respire, right? Because if you're not living in water now, that kind of means that you won't be able to breathe water as easily as you would have if you lived in it, okay? And so these are found on tropical islands and around coastlines all over the globe. So the ones that you are looking at now, to your top right, that little guy there, you can find him on Ascension Island and other islands in the South Atlantic, just to give you an idea of how broadly spread these things are around the world. And then in the bottom right, there is G. carcinus ruricola. And that guy is going to come up a little bit later. You may be looking at it and already thinking to yourself, it looks very, 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 very familiar. That's because it is found here in the Bahamas. It's also found across the rest of the West Indies. And to the red one is a Christmas Island red crab. So if any of you have ever watched a National Geographic documentary and they were talking about a tiny little island where all of the little red crabs march from one side to the other side as they are spawning, that's what that is there. And Christmas Island is found in the Indian Ocean, right? So we've covered the Atlantic, we've been to the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, and they're also found on Pacific coasts as well. There's another species, G. carcinus quadratus, is found on Pacific coasts in the Americas, right? Yay. So let's get very, very Bahamian now, right? So we want to look at the G. carcinid crabs, or at least during my study, I focused on the crabs that live here in the Bahamas, and you may be shocked at the number of items that you see on the screen there, right? So there is most recognizably what we as Bahamians call white crabs, right? Its most common name is the blue land crab, and you can find it along coasts of Brazil, Venezuela, and throughout the West Indies, yes? Now, the thing about the other two, as far as I am concerned, right, being Bahamian myself, I think we as Bahamians refer to both of those, the one in the center and the one on the right, as black crabs, right? Because they have this darker integument. But they are actually two separate species, and taxonomists, the persons who study the different groups of crabs, they are very easily able to identify the differences between them. Generally, lateralis tends to be much smaller. You're going to find it more so on sandy beaches. You're not going to find it as deep in the forest, the coppice forest, as you would find Rurocola, all right? But the blackback land crab, G. lateralis, is found along the Atlantic coast from Texas all the way down to Venezuela, through the Florida Keys, and of course, the West Indies. Tidbit, wherever you see West Indies here, I'm including the Bahamas as well, right? This is geography, not politics. And then there is the black land crab, is that thing's common name, and it's found throughout the islands of the West Indies. So why are these important? That was one of the questions that you saw on the flyer. And just before I move to talking about the importance of this particular three species of crabs, I want you to keep in your mind, you may be asking this question now, right? I almost said Mr. Bonaby because I'm usually talking on a screen to my students, right? But you may be wondering, Rico, so why didn't you mention any of the other crabs that we have in the Bahamas? So there are a number of other crabs that may be found in and around our islands, right? So some are semi-terrestrial, like the little shore crabs that'll be running away from you on those rocky shores. And then of course you have those little ghost crabs. And then we even have some marine crabs as well, right? Like the Atlantic blue crab, as well as the giant marine hermit crab. If you've never heard of that, you should look it up. They will eat conch and steal the shell. There are some quite interesting little critters. But these three, of course, were selected because of their importance to us as a people, all right? And so how are they important to us as a people? Well, let's get started with number one on the agenda. So they are important ecologically. They are important to the ecosystems of our country as well as other countries in the region, and wherever it is that you may find them, as a matter of fact. They have important roles that they play, and we're going to take a look at just two of them relatively briefly. Right, so here is a quote from this was a population study done in Venezuela by the persons who are named at the bottom. It's just a quote from a part of their introduction, and it tells you that land crabs play an important role in the development of mangrove forests, right? And what is this role that they play? Well, we have a tendency to talk about the fact that crabs, will consume detritus, or they will consume, dead organisms or decaying plant matter, right? And in so doing, what you may not recognize is that a number of these species are actually going to drag that leaf litter down into their burrow, and oftentimes they're not going to finish all of it, right? So what this does is this helps to add, this helps to enrich the soils with carbon, right? So anyone studying the carbon cycle, this is it in action, right? And they're also creating microhabits and aerating the soil as they excavate their various burrows, right? There was another study by a Mr. Peter Sherman in 2003. He was focusing on that species that you find on the Pacific coasts of America, right? And what he found was that these crabs accumulated an extensive amount of leaf litter in their burrows. And as I've mentioned, that is likely to affect the soil organic carbon, or in the words of my mom, right? It's making the soil nice and rich, okay? And it also helps to distribute seedlings as well. Now, this is a good point for me to quickly talk about the life cycle of land crabs. So yes, they are divorced almost from their what was their ancestral marine habitat. And for this reason, their life cycle is a little bit interesting, right? So as you may know, crabs are going to walk, as we say, during the wet season, beginning somewhere around June. and going on for a few months. And these are spawning aggregations, right? So they're going to eventually breed, and then those females are going to find their way to the ocean and wash, as we say in the Bahamas, wash their eggs into the surf, right? So those eggs go out into the marine environment, they hatch into these tiny little larvae, right? And these little larvae can be considered to be plankton, right? Zooplankton specifically. So back to their importance in ecology, right? So we have these tiny zooplankton, right? The larval stages of these crabs that exist in the ocean. And in the ocean, they are a part of those food chains and those food webs, all right? Organisms that eat plankton, like small fish, maybe other larval organisms that are larger than they are, will be feeding on them. Yes, and then of course, as they molt and get larger, they eventually resemble an adult crab, but of course they're very, very tiny. And these juveniles, as well as the adults, once they are land-based, they are also fed on by egrets and herons, right? And wild hogs too, since they are a thing in certain islands. Now, that is what eats them. Back to what adult crabs eat. So contrary to your popular belief, because everybody has the Jaws image, I think that was the original Jaws movie where someone washed up on the shore, he was no longer alive, and that person was covered in crabs, right? So contrary to popular belief, the crabs that live here in the Bahamas, they prefer to eat leaves, they prefer to eat fruits and berries and flowers. And as I mentioned already, they prefer decaying plant material, right? It goes on to say, though, at least the literature that is, it goes on to say that at times they will take insects, spiders, feces of different organisms, as well as decaying animals, right? So we have to come out of this nest of everything must be human and human-like, right? Obviously, humans don't dabble in the consumption of, dead, decaying, rotting organisms. But if you are a land crab and your diet has been deficient in protein for a few weeks, and there is a hog that died in the bush, then in order to get your protein, you may go over to the dead hog and have a few pinches, right? That's a part of nature. That's a part of the way this thing works. And so this is a part of their role ecologically as well, right? They are helping to cycle dead, decaying organisms back into minerals or organic compounds that can benefit other living organisms. I am so tempted to stop and be like, any questions? But I'm just going to continue my talk and then take the questions at the end. You can feel free to write questions in the chat if you like. I'll take those towards the end as well. So how else are these things important? Well, they are important to our economy here in the Bahamas, right? So they are captured and sold in local markets. So when I say local, I'm talking about the markets here in the Bahamas, right? They aren't usually an export item. We tend to export, spiny lobster is the largest, I believe, at least the most valuable. We also export some conch, just not to the extent to which we export spiny lobster. But land crabs, the majority of them are caught and consumed right here in the Bahamas, right? So this catching and selling of crabs obviously supports those persons who are out there catching them, right? And, bundling them up and putting them in the sacks and having them shipped to New Providence. That also benefits in some way the mailboat operators because they have something to move. And certainly it benefits your restaurants if folks are selling those native dishes that include crab, right? And last but not least, entrepreneurs, right? So you don't have to be a big old established crab fisher, so to speak, to make a buck off of crabs. You may just decide that this summer you need an extra few bucks. You live on the right island. And so you are going to engage just for this season so you could make the few dollars that it is that you need, right? So just to reinforce this a little bit, I thought this was most interesting last year. Obviously, I was working on this project last year and through to this year. And in the midst of the pandemic, when things were getting really, really crazy, I wish I had noted the date. There's the date of this article. So this was May 2020, right? Everyone was in the thick of it. The Prime Minister, right, during an address on one of those fateful Sundays, most people here, I'm looking at the names, I know most of these names, right? Most people here were very afraid on those Sundays. We didn't know what he was going to say next, right? But during his address this one time, he had let folks know that on those islands where, crab fishing is, or crab catching, crabbing is a thing, right? That those folks would be allowed to do so. Yes, and this was beyond whatever weekend lockdown there was, or beyond whatever early curfew that was at that time, right? So this is evidence to show you how significant this fishery is to the economy of some of those local communities. And certainly, I am talking about Andros is definitely the number one, right? Don't neglect that other family islands also engage in this, but Andros by far is the largest player. Okay. And so one resident in this very same article, he had said that folks can make up to $10,000 in one season. If I was aware of that 6-7 years ago, I would have been catching crabs all my life, right? Because that's a few months and you make 10 grand. I don't think you could beat that, right? And I also found this quote just to be a little bit, it is informative, but I also found it funny, and I said that I would share it with you. So one of the ladies that the Guardian interviewed, she said, the season is important because you can go and get your little crabs, sell them, make your little money, buy the things you need to fix your house up with, because the island, you always need to fix things up. And if you sell them crabs for 25 a dozen, you can make a couple of dollars well, but you gotta treat your crabs good. Because if you mistreat your crabs, when you get to Nassau, all will die. So you have to take your time, feed them. And this is what I thought was crazy. She said, you can't rough up your crabs, right? She said, don't rough them up. All right, so I hope that made you chuckle. Next up, how else are they important to us? So just like the other commercially important species in the country, that is conch, queen conch, spiny lobster, and Nassau grouper, our consumption of land crabs, right, has added a particular flair to our lifestyle. And I don't think there was a better way for me to say that on this slide, because that's what it is, right? It's the pizzazz that Bahamians have, because I could catch crabs and most likely you can't, right? Especially if you're having a conversation with someone who is from North America or Europe, they have no idea what you're talking about, right? Especially when it involves putting your hand down into a hole to retrieve them. So let's unpack this just a little bit. I love the questions that are rolling in. I'm trying not to be a teacher and read them as I go, but I promise I will answer them towards the end. All right, and for anyone just joining, thank you so much for doing so. So yes, there is an annual festive weekend in the Bahamas based all on land crabs, right? And it is the famous, the infamous All Andros Crab Fest that usually happens that midweek in June. I have never taken advantage of the opportunities to go when I was in high school. And my life as a teacher has also, my life as a good teacher has also prevented me from attending, because that time is usually round about exam time. And so we would be invigilating, school isn't closed yet, right? So I need to get down there for a crab fest, but I have been to Andros, as I mentioned earlier. So it's in, you know, there are all sorts of things that happen. There's crab catching competitions, fashion shows, you name it, right? Whatever kind of crab dishes that you care to have, you'll be able to find. So culture, right? I don't know many places where there is a crab fest. As a matter of fact, in 2014, the Tribune reported that about 10,000 people that year had descended upon Central Andros to engage in the crab fest. Now, I imagine that the majority of that 10,000 would have been Bahamians, many of whom come from New Providence, for the most part, maybe even Freeport. I don't know. Do Freeport people come down to Crab Fest? Maybe. Let me know in the chat, right? But this report talked about the fact that folks came from China, Greece, Belgium, England, and of course the United States, all in order to be a part of this particular festive weekend, all right? So it is a big old to-do. Also, small point. We also have a song that is concerned with our crabs as well. Now, I'm a little bit young, right? Don't judge by, you know, all of this bed and bags under my eyes, but I'm a little bit young. So as far as I know, it's just the one song, and that's Church Out, Crab Crawling, right? So no one else, I don't think, does this sort of thing. Then too, there is just the act of crab catching in of itself, right? This is a part of who we are as a people, right? To me, it parallels sitting at the conch stand and having your scotch gum, right? It is a rite of passage, I imagine, for those folks who grew up on these islands where, you know, selling crabs, the sale of crabs, the capture and the sale of crabs is so very important to their island's economy. You know, we know how it goes, right? Your Grammy, your grandpappy are going to be teaching you how it is to do this. And it gets passed down from generation to generation. And so I can't put a money value on this particular point, but I do believe, and I would argue, that based on just the intrinsic value of this activity, it's something that we should preserve, right? Now, next up, I can remember my little transition for this one. So when I shared this flyer with a good friend of my sister, she responded to me by saying, Rico, my only interest in these things is eating them, you know. And I was like, well, it's not my only interest, but I am interested in eating them because I like to eat food, okay? And crab dishes taste good, okay? So there are a number of them. I was expecting to have a few more Americans on this call, folks who are not known to me, who I imagine came from the US or anywhere else, right? But as you all know, or the majority of you know, crab and rice, crab and dough, stuffed crab, crab and grits, crab soup, crab cakes, any and everything that you can think of, we here in the Bahamas are certainly cleaning up and then cooking up and having crab in that particular dish, all right? Good stuff. So that's all of the happy business. This isn't unhappy business, right? But it's a little less exciting, a little less comfortable, I'd imagine. So what don't we know, all right? What don't we know? Well, when I turn to the next slide, I just want you as best as you can to give it a read. Of course, I'll still be talking. And try to put some pieces together and see where it is that I'm going with respect to what is it that we do not know. All right, so the presentation is still about land crabs. All right, don't get me wrong now, just follow me. But the queen conch, Lobatus gigas, there is a quote from a paper that was a report, a review of the fisheries here in the Bahamas by DMR for the FAO in 2016. And that report, in there, you see the quote, it says that several areas have been assessed by community conch, and I imagine other organizations as well. And they describe the queen conch population as declining precipitously, okay, since the 1990s. Then there is the Caribbean spiny lobster. As I mentioned, keep this in mind. Spiny lobster is quoted to be the largest export fishery here in the Bahamas, right? Bringing us some $60 million odd in exports. That was in 2014, particularly it was about $61 or $2 million, right? That came out of that same report by the DMR, okay? But that species, as important as it is to us, right? The IUCN, so this is the organization that establishes whether or not something is threatened, endangered, so on, and critically endangered, etc. They list the Caribbean spiny lobster as data deficient, right? Which means that there is not sufficient information, right, on this species. Now, this, to be honest, that particular statement is not Bahamas specific, but it refers to its status across the region, right? But it's still not necessarily a good thing. It goes on to say, right, on that very same page, that the research needs include population size and distribution. We need to know how many spiny lobsters there are, right, before we can make particular decisions with respect to their conservation and the management of their conservation, right? I imagine you all are seeing a trend here now, but I'll definitely finish up with the third one. And by then, I'm certain that you would see that there is a trend here. Don't be so very frightened, is my response to that very last question, right? So Nassau grouper, what about them, right? So two pieces of information are on the screen here for you. One is fishery dependent, right? So that information is based on the catch of grouper, how much grouper is caught per annum, right? It's fishery dependent data. And again, in that same fisheries report, they tell you over time, recorded landings of Nassau grouper have been declining. So that's piece of information number one. Fishery dependent, it's relying on fisheries data to come to this conclusion. Now, in a review done by Krista Sherman and a whole lot of other authors, you see the reference down at the bottom. That's a quote from her paper there. After analyzing fishery independent data, right? So this now is information that these folks have gone out on their own, right, to gather outside of the fishing data. Yes, they note that over the course of 14 years, there are significant declines in Nassau grouper densities throughout the country, right? So if you haven't gotten my point just yet, if I could click over, this here is my major point, right? We need to know the state of our land crabs populations, all right? If we do not know the state of their populations, then we will be surprised, right, when the crabbing community, they're going out and they're only finding small ones, right? We might be surprised by the fact that, you know, and I'm talking maybe 100 years from now, 150 years from now, someone's gonna go out and make, you know, they're gonna be scarce, right? So we need to study these populations. Now that's me getting a little bit, not emotional, but that's a little passion because I've been working on this for so long. So back to my notes, right? So if you, like me, like good food, right? The last slide obviously has perturbed you a little bit. Yes, because Rico likes to eat conch, Rico likes to eat lobster, Rico likes to eat grouper, and I also like to eat crab. Wow, that's powerful. So one of the questions you may be asking is, am I suggesting that crab populations are declining? No, I cannot suggest that. I cannot suggest that because to date, I have no evidence from a population study that tells me that. All right. Now, there is also, in addition to that, there is a crab replenishment reserve on the island of Andros, right? So, y'all need to stay on this chat. There is a crab replenishment reserve on the island of Andros that was established by the BNT, right? So, you know, hopefully the populations are not declining. Now, another question that you may ask then is, so is it possible that they are declining? Because Mr. Bonaby, you taught us in class, or we learned in class that, you know, crabs lay hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of eggs when they go out there and wash their eggs into the ocean. So it can't be possible, right, for their populations to decline. So the question again is it possible that they are declining? The only answer that I can proffer you is maybe. Maybe it is declining. Maybe it's not declining. But the issue is we don't know the state of the population of the land crabs here in the Bahamas, right? So in other jurisdictions, just to give you an idea, in other jurisdictions, including Venezuela and Puerto Rico, where they have done population studies, I hope we're seeing what it is that I'm driving at here, right? In these jurisdictions, they have found that there are instances of population decline. In the case of Venezuela, that one was particularly interesting. I can't remember the names of the communities, right? They're obviously not English names, so they didn't stick very well. But in one area of Venezuela, they found that, you know, the crab populations were fine, but in other areas, they were able to note that populations had declined significantly in those particular areas. Now, Venezuela is a continental country. I don't teach geography, but you know what I mean, right? It's not an island. But at the same time, this should make you think about the Bahamas as well, because we have a number of islands where these species are supported, right? And a number of those islands are engaged in the commercial fishery, right? So we don't know because we've done no population studies, right? Now I'm going a little bit further because this is the sticking point for a lot of Bahamians over the last 5 years. And that sticking point is with respect to conch and what is it that we should do, right? Because it's no longer a secret at this point now that the population of conch is in decline, right? That has been stated. So the study I referenced was a 2011 study. That's 10 years ago, right? This old news, okay? But we haven't necessarily, as far as I'm aware, changed the way we've done things. There is the conservation, what can I call that? Conservation awareness campaign, a group. It's made up of multiple partners, right? These environmental organizations who obviously they recognize the need for some expanded conservation efforts with respect to conch. And now I'm getting too far down the political road, so I'll just leave it alone. But you all understand what it is that I'm getting at, right? There have been those commercials, Conch Gone, the Conch Gone song, right? So it is a point of conversation, but as far as I am aware, and I'm recording, so very important if you quote me, I said, as far as I am aware, nothing new has been done by DMR with respect to conch as yet. Right? So the last question arising from my big old rant about the declining populations of our other commercially important species, you may also wonder if I am suggesting that there be a closed season. You may be wondering if I am suggesting that there should be more conservation efforts, right? So outside of closed seasons, like maybe the size and this and that. Well, the truth is no, right? No, my answer is no. All I am simply saying, as it is emblazoned upon your screen right now, I am simply saying we need to know the state of our land crab populations. If we are aware, right, of what is happening, then we can have something to base any conservation efforts that may be needed. We can have something to base that on, right? I cannot suggest to you that we have more conservation management, closed seasons, blah, 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 with respect to land crabs, if I cannot tell you the state of their population, right? So the inquiry part of this project, you may be wondering now, that was, I think I mentioned that it was a literature review. And what I had done in that literature review was I searched for the best methods to carry out such a study, right? In thinking initially, it should kind of be easier than conch, crawfish, or grouper, right? Because you actually have to get out on a boat. Someone needs to most likely be able to scuba dive, right? In order to conduct those sorts of surveys. But land crabs, land, are terrestrial, all right? So I thought this may be a species where we can be able to understand their population dynamics, distribution, all of the fancy words that come behind population sometimes, density, abundance, whatever you want to talk about, right? And then, yes, so that's what I've done so far. My future though, my hope for the future that is to conduct a pilot of such an assessment. Before COVID started to get crazy and I had to make a lot of changes to this work, initially I was considering Adelaide. Those of you who are on this call and aware of where it is that I live, you know that I can find my way to Adelaide in about 10 to 15 minutes. So going out there at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and just looking around for crabs, or just going early in the morning to set transects and place quadrats, right? That would be easy for me to accomplish. So I'm in the process of completing this proposed method, right? And so hopefully that leads to a pilot of such a study. And then this is the hopeful young man inside the old teacher, right? I would hope that I can refine it as necessary and eventually have it conducted across the islands, particularly those that support commercial crabbing. Now, you may think to yourself, so Delreco or Mr. Bonaby, whatever it is that you call me, how are you going to survey, right? For example, all of the crabs on Andros. Well, anyone who's done a little bit of research, you know that you don't survey, you don't find all, right? You work with a healthy sample size. But the real answer to that is through this course, I have found that community engagement is one of the parts of conservation that I think needs to be at the forefront, for a lack of a better word, right? So as best as is possible, I genuinely would like to involve the persons who are involved in this industry. Truth be told, I may not be able to get some crab and rice, right? If something happens to the crab populations, but that's a drop in the bucket when you consider generations of young people coming up whose parents, grandparents who are alive today, like maybe my age, right, who are depending on this fishery, right? So it is most important, in my opinion. It's important to everyone, right? But I know it is most important to those particular local communities. And further to that, it's the local communities that have so much to add and so much to teach us about, everything in the natural world. It's always what's the big word? The artisanal fisherman who is able to let the scientists know, hey, listen, I haven't seen a snapper bigger than my hand around here in 5 years, right? And that may be the first time that that scientist gets any inkling of the changing, the declining of that particular population. It nothing happened to snappers now. That was an example, right? Yes, and I've rambled on and I've kind of forgotten my train of thought. So while the soapbox is still mine, I do want to put this plug in there that as best as you can, my people, most of whom you are, my people, Bahamians, right? Let us, yes, exactly, traditional knowledge. That's exactly correct. We need to, as best as we can, follow or try to abide by, right, to uphold the conservation efforts, sorry, the conservation protocols that are set out, right? If grouper season is December 1st to, what's it, February 28th, right? December through to February, then you shouldn't be able to pick up, right, a fresh slab of grouper from Uncle Tom, okay? Because Uncle Tom is taking food out of your unborn grandchildren's mouth. All right, so I'll just leave that as it is. That's just one example. We could talk about conch too, right? Or lobster or any of the others that there are conservation management policies in place for. I've been looking for the word policies for the last 40 seconds, okay? But yes, traditional knowledge, if we want to talk about traditional knowledge, I didn't have to go to COB to be able to differentiate between a male and a female crab, right? My family members taught me that because crabs were a part of the kitchen, right? And so it was just a curious thing to tell the little children that this one is a boy and this one is a girl, right? And it has to do, of course, with the underside and the width of that part of their shell. Okay. And so I think I am just about ready now to demit my soapbox, and I would be right on time because it's 7:21. That leaves me very close to the hour time that I had set for myself. So just before I go, I am not the best Christian, nor do I pretend or tell people that I am. However, I recognize that Bahamians, by and large, are a Christian people, all right? And Lord have mercy, okay, yes, keep going, right? My people are a Christian people. So I just leave you with the words of the prophet Hosea, right? Chapter 4, verse 6. And it says, as you see there, my people are destroyed for lack of what? Knowledge. Right? And because you have rejected knowledge, he, God the Father, also will reject you from being his priest, since you have forgotten the law of your God, and he will also forget your children. Right? So I want you all to always think of how these things are teeing off on the very, very last part of that verse, how these things, right, will affect your future, and maybe not your future directly, because maybe you have 80 years left, right? You know, just like me, I'm going to be around here for another 80 years, right? But we are talking about the generations that are yet unborn. Now, again, I did tell you that I'm not the best Christian. So I did, after looking up this verse, I made sure that I found myself an explanation. So you all don't say that Mr. Bonaby tried to quote scripture, but he didn't know what he was talking about, right? And this website, it essentially says, may we never, ever reject the knowledge of truth and the wisdom that we have received, right? And may we develop a teachable spirit which is able to make us strong in the Lord. All right, and so with that, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I will now start to try to get through the questions in the chat, and then I will open the floor if that is okay. Before I leave, Before I start with questions, I was supposed to say a big thanks to my professor and my advisor, she is just the best kind of person for supporting me and this research. So here we go now. First question I see here. Why the imposter, in brackets, crab, is an imposter? Unfortunately, I wish I was a crab biologist. I am not, right? I have only studied those that I have studied. I don't even know what it is that Bahamians call the imposter crab. I have no idea. Maybe you mean the ghost crab because they are ghosts, or they have that pale appearance that helps them to, in a sense, blend in with the sand. But I'm not familiar with imposter crabs. I actually did have a question. Since these crabs eat so many different things, are these crabs ideally good for us to be eating? Ha 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 ha. I know someone was gonna ask that question, right? Especially that I already put the plug in there because I know most of us who say that we don't eat crabs, we say that we don't eat crabs. Turn on the light for me, please. Say that we don't eat crabs because they eat dead things, right? But I don't want to answer the question in high school debate fashion, but I will, right? Because these very same people are the very same people who eat pork chop and bacon and need to have some ham skin in their rice, right? And of course, pigs eat slop. So, organisms take food in. That food is digested, which means that it is broken down into its component molecules and then absorbed into the tissues of that organism. Now, the only time, this is going back to the science of the matter now, the only time that business is not good for you is biomagnification or bioaccumulation, right? So long story short, your higher level consumers, things like sharks, Goliath, grouper, anything that you can think of, usually that is at the top of a food chain, right? What has happened is all of the organisms at the lower levels would have absorbed whatever poison that we're talking about, right? And that poison would then continue to be stored away in the tissues of each subsequent consumer. And then time as you get to the that ultimate predator, what happens is their muscles, their fat is loaded with that particular poison. So I have not seen or read that that is an issue with land crabs. Again, I only know that to be an issue with very large predators towards the top of the food chain. All right, yes. I have a question too. Is there a specific cause for the amount of genetic diversity of crabs on the planet? Powerful. That is a powerful question, because that's a question that I sat and asked myself a few times as I was completing this work. And truth be told, excuse me, my scientists don't say my best guess, eh? But a hypothesis is an educated guess, right? It's a testable statement, right? So someone, if you'd like, you can go out and test this statement. As far as I believe, right, or understand, I'm almost certain it has something to do with the distribution of them in their larval stages, right? So as we mentioned earlier, there are a number of land crab species in this family, G. carcinidae. They're found all around the world, tropical islands, tropical coastlines, etc., right? But what you will note is that some of them that are established, for example, G. ruricola, Cardasuma, well, let's not do that tonight, right? What we call white crabs, right? And one of what we call black crabs, the G. ruricola, they have relatively extensive ranges, right? But when you take a look at some of those other species, like the one that's only found on Ascension Island and the surrounding islands, then you have the Christmas Island red crab that's only found on Christmas Island. And then you have some others that are only found in this particular archipelago or the other particular archipelago, I think a lot of that has to do with what we call island biogeography, which simply states that once species, what species get to a particular island. So this can be an actual island, or it can be what are referred to as sky islands. So very, very high places, right? Or even places that have extensively fractured terrain. A good example is New Zealand. When you look at those sorts of places, you find that there are a lot of speciation events that would have happened, meaning that, you know, they're separated and they have changed in a sense to become some other species. It's a business of evolution. Well, that is a great question. By the way, that question came from one of my AP Bio students who was trying to test me, and I hope I didn't fail. Good stuff. Good stuff, Crochet. Thank you for that. Thank you for your compliment there. This is a question. Can they be farmed effectively and efficiently or on a commercial scale? I have not looked into that. I have not looked into that. That is something that I imagine that we should be thinking about. There was some paper going around. I have yet to make time to read it, but there was some paper going around about the conch farming business that's been happening in some, I think, somewhere in the same region. So it is something to think about, but I am not certain how effective that would be. I'm not certain how effective that would be. So also, are our crabs in any danger of significant depopulation or extinction? And if the answer is yes or no, what could cause such a thing going forward? Now, I did see this question roll in before I got towards the end of the presentation. I cannot say that. I hope that is not the case. But certainly, you know, playing it by ear, as we tend to say, is not the best way to go. We should, at some point, have these studies done so that we can determine whether or not they are in significant danger. I would hope not. I'm trying to hope not. Genuinely, I don't think so, but that's just me thinking. That is not evidence-based at all. Yes, LOL, I heard that. And then my good friend, elaborate, good brother. You all talking about the fact that I like to eat crab. I won't elaborate on that, and everyone who gets it will have a chuckle at home. Right. Any more questions in here? Other than loss of a food source, would there be any negative impacts if crabs were to? Well, I mean, we can predict, sorry, read the whole question. So other than loss of a food source, would there be any negative impacts if crabs were to go extinct, like an environmental impact due to loss of biodiversity? So if all of them went extinct around the world, that would be absolutely terrible, right? That would be the worst thing, because you would have the disruption of many food chains, and it would just be terrible. The impact here in the Bahamas, though, specifically with the loss of just these 3 species, I imagine it would be recognizable. It would be something that, you know, ecologists would be able to go out and observe, right? If those species were extirpated, is the word you're looking for in the Bahamas. But the thing usually is, you know, with some of the worst environmental disasters relating to the loss of a particular species or group of species, we as human beings did not learn of the severity of losing that species until after it was lost, right? There is something with California. Oh, Jesus. It was a keystone species there. It was overfished or overexploited. And essentially, so a keystone species, as you imagine, it's the keystone, it's what's holding up the arch. So the entire ecosystems essentially collapsed. I wish I could remember the name of the species. I cannot right now. But there are a number of examples like that. So oftentimes we don't know the extent to which losing a particular species is going to impact the rest of the environment until it happens. And that's why we have what's called the precautionary principle, I believe it is. So you want to act in such a way, right, that you are not causing harm, is the long and short of that idea. So that was another good one. My brain is a ticking. Yes, Mr. McKenzie, I agree. Since you mentioned the crabs in which we do eat, which crabs are not edible? Ooh, I wouldn't go there and say that there are crabs that are not edible. I've never seen that. What I can say is that here in the Bahamas, we eat those 3 species that we like to eat. I can't speak to examples of people eating ghost crabs because ghost crabs are hard to catch, right? Folks do eat the shore crabs though. The ones that you'll find on the rocky shores. A lot of times people do eat those. Again, I haven't known or seen Bahamians eating them, but I very recently watched a video of a guy dumping some chicken legs that he had tied up on a rope into a little hole, like a rock pool. And then all of the crabs, ran to the chicken and kind of latched onto it. And then he had himself a bucket of crabs. So folks eat a number of crab species across the globe. All 3 that we have in the Bahamas, they're eaten throughout their ranges. In Florida, they're considered to be pests. I thought that was a fun fact that I'd throw in there for you. They do occur in Florida, these same white crabs, and Floridians just consider them a pest because they ruin their grass. They ruin their gardens with their burrows. Did you say one wasn't a true crab? Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. So that's just taxonomic speak. So that's just, Jesus, how would I say that? It simply means that they are not as well put together as the true crabs are, right? So when you think white crab, black crab, the ones that we eat, the ghost crab that you'll see on the beach, right? The shore crab that you'll see on the shoreline, those jump out at you as crabs, right? But if you pull a hermit crab out of the shell, that's not really, that body shape is not crab-like, right? And what you'll find is that the false crabs, or the crabs in the group, the anomurans, and I pray I said that correctly, they are a group of things that just don't fit very well into the true crabs group, right? So they include things like hermit crabs, as I've mentioned, right? Because they look a little funny, which is even worse. It's like crab discrimination, right? That's like the conch scavengers myth, but that's a talk for another day. It certainly is, or it could be a talk for right now. Conch are not scavengers. Conch are herbivores. They're little cows of the seagrass. That's all them do, right? That's all they do. They are herbivorous. Thank you for all of the compliments. That's the crab I was talking about in a shell. Okay. Still ain't sure I know what that means. Okay, cool. All right, so I've done with the questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask here? And now I realize that I still have everybody's mic muted. I'm sorry about that. But everyone is now free to unmute themselves if they have a question. I guess raising hands would be the best way to keep this in order. And then going. Or is everyone satisfied? You are welcome, my good child. All right, so just like in class, if there are no further questions for me, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate your positive remarks. We live in the Bahamas. BPL tried it, but the devil is a liar. All right, so you all take good care, stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you soon, right, as volunteers to help me on the pilot project. Smile, smile, twinkle, twinkle. All right, everyone take good care. Thank you so very much for coming. And I imagine some of us are gonna have a few chats after this one. All right, you all take good care. I'm going to sign off now. Bye everyone, have a good evening.